The distant thunder rolled like a drum across the dusty horizon, as Jackson Prentice stared down the barrel of his Winchester at the man who'd stolen his cattle. 5 years riding with nothing but his horse and the vast Montana sky for company had hardened him into something unrecognizable from the fresh-faced boy who'd left home at 18. Now at 26, he was known throughout Shoshone City as a man who delivered justice with deadly precision. But never once had he bent his knee or clasped his hands in prayer, not even when they'd buried his father 3 winters past. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory was still wild, still dangerous, despite the encroaching railroads and the growing settlements. Jackson squeezed the trigger, his bullet finding its mark in the wooden post just inches from the rustler's ear. "Next one won't miss," he called out, his voice carrying across the windswept plain. "Drop the rope and walk away." The thief raised his hands slowly, the stolen cattle lowing nervously behind him. "Don't shoot, Prentice. I got a family." "Should have thought about them before you took what wasn't yours," Jackson replied, but he didn't fire again. He never killed if he didn't have to. That was one line he wouldn't cross, though many in his profession had no such qualms. The rustler scurried away, leaving the cattle behind. Jackson sighed, dismounting from his chestnut gelding, Shadow. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold. He'd have to make camp and drive the cattle back to the Peterson ranch in the morning. As he gathered wood for a fire, Jackson felt the familiar hollow ache in his chest. 5 years of solitude had worn on him in ways he didn't care to admit. The other cowboys spoke of sweethearts waiting in town, of letters from home, of the comfort found in prayer. Jackson had none of these. His mother had died when he was a boy, his father was gone, and he'd never learned to pray, never believed there was anyone listening. "You ain't ever going to settle down, are you, Prentice?" Old man Peterson had asked him just last week when delivering his pay. "A man needs roots. Needs something to come home to." Jackson had just tipped his hat and pocketed his coins. What was the point in explaining that he didn't know how to build a home when he'd never really had one? The fire crackled to life, and Jackson settled against his saddle, watching the stars emerge one by one. Tomorrow he'd return the cattle, collect his reward, and move on to the next job. That was his life, uncomplicated, reliable, and utterly alone. Little did he know that 50 miles east, a stagecoach was making its way toward Shoshone City, carrying a passenger who would change everything. Zara Reynolds clutched her small leather-bound journal as the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain. At 22, she was traveling alone for the first time in her life, having left behind her comfortable existence in Boston to accept a teaching position in Montana Territory. The daughter of a minister, Zara had been raised in a house where faith was as essential as breathing, where each day began and ended in prayer. "Not much further now, miss," the driver called down. "Shoshone City'll be coming up over the next ridge." Zara attempted a smile despite her exhaustion. 3 weeks of travel had left her body aching and her spirit wavering. Was she truly ready for this new life? Her father had begged her to reconsider. "The West is no place for a refined young woman," he'd insisted. Especially not one alone, but Zara had been determined. After her fiancé had broken their engagement to marry a wealthier woman, she'd needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the pitying glances and whispered gossip. "I'll be teaching children to read and write," she'd reasoned. "Surely there's no higher calling, even in the wilds of Montana." Now, as the stagecoach crested the hill and Shoshone City came into view, Zara felt her breath catch. It was smaller than she'd imagined, just a scattering of wooden buildings along a dusty main street, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. This would be her home now, The coach rolled to a stop outside the town's only hotel, a two-story structure with peeling white paint. Zara gathered her belongings, one trunk and a carpet bag, and descended with the driver's assistance. "School's just down the way," he said, pointing. "New building, the pride of the town, so they say." Zara thanked him, paid for her room at the hotel, and decided to see the schoolhouse immediately. As she walked down the main street, she felt the stares of the townspeople. A woman alone, dressed in her Eastern finery, was clearly an oddity here. She lifted her chin and continued on her way. The schoolhouse was indeed new, a simple one-room building with large windows and a small bell tower. Zara's heart lifted at the sight of it. This was why she'd come all this way. This was her purpose. "You must be Miss Reynolds," a voice called out. Zara turned to see a stout woman in a practical brown dress approaching. "I am Mrs. Hollister, head of the school board," the woman said, extending her hand. "We're mighty pleased you've arrived safely. Term starts in 3 days, gives you time to settle in and meet some of the families." "Thank you, Mrs. Hollister. I'm eager to begin." "Fair warning, miss," Mrs. Hollister said, lowering her voice. "Some of these children have never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. Their parents are farmers, ranchers, miners, hard-working folk, but education hasn't always been their priority." "I understand," Zara replied. "I'm prepared for the challenge." Mrs. Hollister nodded approvingly. "We'll be holding a social at the church tomorrow night. Everyone will be there, well, almost everyone. It'll be a chance for you to meet the community." "That sounds wonderful," Zara said, though the prospect of facing an entire town of strangers made her stomach twist with anxiety. As they parted ways, Zara returned to the hotel, where the proprietor's wife showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. Alone at last, Zara sank onto the narrow bed and opened her journal. She recorded her first impressions of Shoshone City, then closed her eyes and prayed for strength and guidance in the days ahead. She could never have imagined that her prayer would soon intertwine with the life of a man who had never uttered one of his own. Jackson rode into Shoshone City the following afternoon. The recovered cattle safely returned to the Peterson ranch. The main street was busier than usual, with women carrying covered dishes toward the church and men in their Sunday best, despite it being a Saturday. "What's all the fuss about?" Jackson asked the livery stable owner as he dismounted. "Social at the church tonight," the man replied. New school teachers arrived from back east, whole towns turning out to welcome her. Jackson nodded but had no intention of attending. Church socials weren't his idea of an evening well spent. He preferred the straightforward company at the saloon, where expectations were simple and clear. After settling shadow in the livery, Jackson made his way to the sheriff's office to report on the rustler he'd encountered. Sheriff Mills was an old friend, as close to a friend as Jackson allowed himself these days. "Prentice," Mills greeted him with a nod. "Heard you caught Daniels trying to make off with Peterson's cattle." "He won't try it again anytime soon," Jackson said, dropping into a chair across from the sheriff's desk. "You staying in town tonight?" "Just long enough to restock supplies, then I'm heading out to the Carson place." "They've been having trouble with wolves." Mills eyed him thoughtfully. "Ever think about settling down? Town could use a deputy with your skills." Jackson almost laughed. "And spend my days chasing drunks out of the saloon? No thanks. There's more to life than riding the range, you know." "Church social tonight, new schoolteacher from Boston. Pretty as a picture, they say." "Not interested," Jackson replied flatly. Mills sighed. "Suit yourself, but you're missing out living the way you do." Jackson departed shortly after, making his way to the general store to purchase supplies. As he exited with his saddlebags full, he nearly collided with a young woman hurrying down the boardwalk. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed. steadying herself against the storefront. Jackson tipped his hat automatically, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. They were a striking shade of green, bright against her fair skin. Her hair was auburn, partially visible beneath her bonnet, and she carried herself with an unmistakable Eastern refinement. "No harm done, madam," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. She smiled tentatively. "Are you attending the social this evening? I'm Zara Reynolds, the new schoolteacher." "Jackson Prentice," he replied. "And no, madam, I won't be there. Got business elsewhere." Something like disappointment flickered across her face. "Well, it was nice to meet you, Mr. Prentice. Perhaps another time." She continued on her way, and Jackson found himself watching her go, noticing the determined set of her shoulders despite her delicate appearance. Then he shook his head, reminding himself that women like her, educated, refined, full of Eastern ideas, had no place in his life. He mounted Shadow and rode out of town, telling himself he was glad to be leaving the commotion behind. But as the miles stretched out before him, he found himself thinking of green eyes and a gentle voice asking about a social he had no interest in attending. Zara's first week in Shoshone City passed in a blur of new faces and challenges. The social had been overwhelming but successful. She'd met dozens of townsfolk and the parents of many of her future students. She'd been welcomed warmly, if a bit curiously, as most had never encountered a woman who'd attended college. On Monday morning, she stood nervously before her class of 22 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Some, as Mrs. Hollister had warned, had never been to school before. Others had sporadic attendance at best. By Friday, Zara was exhausted but determined. These children deserved an education, and she would provide it, no matter the obstacles. Saturday brought a welcome respite. Zara decided to explore the area surrounding the town, walking along the creek that ran just beyond the southern edge of Shoshone City. The September day was warm, the sky a brilliant blue. She found a peaceful spot beneath a cottonwood tree and settled there with her journal and a book of poetry. She'd been reading for perhaps an hour when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider on a chestnut horse was coming along the creek, and as he drew nearer, she recognized him as the cowboy she'd briefly encountered outside the general store, Jackson Prentice. He slowed his horse when he saw her, appearing momentarily uncertain whether to continue or turn back. Zara raised her hand in greeting, and after a moment's hesitation, he guided his mount toward her. "Miss Reynolds," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here." "I needed some quiet after my first week of teaching," she explained. The creek seemed like a good place for reflection. He nodded, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep blue, his face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than a few years older than her, but something in those eyes spoke of experiences far beyond his years. "How was your business the other night?" she asked, remembering their brief exchange. "Took care of it," he replied simply. Then, perhaps feeling that was too curt, he added, "Dealing with wolves threatening a rancher's livestock." "You're not a rancher yourself." "No, madam. I work when and where I'm needed. Tracking, hunting, protection. Whatever pays." Zara nodded, trying to imagine such a transient existence. "And do you enjoy it? The freedom of it, I mean." Jackson seemed surprised by the question. Most people didn't ask him about enjoyment, they just wanted to know if he could do the job. "Never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "It's what I know." An awkward silence fell between them. Zara closed her book and stood, brushing the grass from her skirt. "I should be getting back to town," she said. "It was nice to see you again, Mr. Prentice." He dismounted suddenly. "I'll walk with you if you don't mind. These parts can be unpredictable." Touched by the unexpected gesture, Zara nodded. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." They walked side by side, Shadow following obediently behind his master. Zara sensed that conversation didn't come easily to Jackson Prentice, so she filled the silence with stories about her first week of teaching. Jimmy Hollister, Mrs. Hollister's youngest, brought a frog to class and released it during our arithmetic lesson, she recounted, smiling at the memory. "You've never seen such chaos. The girls were screaming, the boys were diving under desks trying to catch it. Finally, little Sarah Peterson calmly picked it up and announced she was taking it home for supper." To her surprise and delight, Jackson laughed a genuine, unguarded sound that transformed his stern features. "The Petersons are practical folk," he said. "Old man Peterson would be proud. You know them, worked for them last week. Good people." He glanced at her. "How are you finding Shoshone City? Must be different from Boston." "Very different," Zara admitted. "But in good ways, mostly. People here are direct, honest. In Boston, there are so many layers of propriety and expectation. Sometimes it's hard to know what's real." Jackson considered this. "Out here, reality hits you square in the face. No time for pretense when you're facing blizzards, drought, or bandits." They had reached the edge of town now. Zara knew they would soon part ways, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she was reluctant for their conversation to end. "Will you be staying in town long?" she asked. "A few days. Got some business with the blacksmith, then I'm heading north. Perhaps I'll see you at church tomorrow." The invitation slipped out before she could consider it. Jackson's expression closed immediately. "I don't attend church, Miss Reynolds." His tone left no room for discussion, and Zara regretted her assumption. "Of course. Well, goodbye then, Mr. Prentice. Thank you for the escort." He tipped his hat once more, mounted his horse, and rode toward the livery stable without another word. Zara watched him go, wondering at the sudden change in his demeanor. What was it about church that had caused such a reaction? As she walked to her boarding house, where she'd moved after her first few days at the hotel, Zara found herself thinking about the enigmatic cowboy. There was something compelling about him, not just his rugged good looks, but a depth of character that intrigued her. She hoped their paths would cross again before he left town. The following morning, Zara sat in the front pew of Shoshone City's small church, her thoughts occasionally drifting to Jackson Prentice, despite her best efforts to focus on Reverend Thompson's sermon. Why had he reacted so strongly to her mention of church? And why did she care? After the service, as congregants gathered outside to socialize, Mrs. Hollister approached her with a concerned expression. "Miss Reynolds, I saw you walking with Jackson Prentice yesterday," she said, lowering her voice. "I feel I should warn you he has quite a reputation." "What sort of reputation?" Zara asked, immediately defensive, though she wasn't sure why. "He's a loner, that one. Been drifting around these parts for years. Never attends church, never participates in community affairs. They say his gun work is too quick to be entirely honest." "He seemed perfectly gentlemanlike to me," Zara replied. Mrs. Hollister frowned. "I'm sure he did. But a young woman in your position must be careful about appearances. A schoolteacher must be above reproach." Zara bristled at the implication. "I assure you, Mrs. Hollister, my reputation is secure. Mr. Prentice simply escorted me back to town as a courtesy." "Of course, dear. I meant no offense." Mrs. Hollister patted her arm. "I only wish to caution you, small towns have long memories and quick tongues." As the older woman moved away to speak with others, Zara felt a flash of indignation. She had done nothing improper, and Jackson, despite his apparent aversion to church, had been perfectly respectful. The townspeople's judgment seemed unfair. Later that afternoon, as Zara was preparing her lessons for the coming week, A knock came at her boarding house door. She opened it to find Sheriff Mills standing on the porch. "Good afternoon, Miss Reynolds," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sheriff." "What can I do for you?" "I've come with a request. We've got a situation with young Billy Tanner, you know, the blacksmith's boy. He's 14 and refusing to attend school. His father's at his wits' end." Zara frowned. "Yes, I've noticed his absence, Mrs. Tanner mentioned he was helping at the forge. That's part of it. The boy thinks school's a waste of time since he'll be taking over the smithy someday. But there's more to it Billy can't raid, and he's ashamed to admit it in front of the younger children." "I see," Zara said, her heart going out to the boy. "What would you suggest?" "I thought perhaps you might be willing to tutor him separately in the evenings, just until he catches up enough to join the regular class." Zara considered this. "Of course I will. Every child deserves an education." "Thank you, miss. His father will be mighty grateful." Sheriff Mills hesitated. "There's one more thing. Jackson Prentice is a friend of the Tanner family. Billy looks up to him. Might help if Prentice encouraged the boy about these lessons." "Do you think Mr. Prentice would do that?" "If I ask him, he might. He'll be at the saloon tonight, always stops there before he leaves town." Zara bit her lip, considering. It wasn't proper for a young, unmarried woman, especially a schoolteacher, to enter a saloon. But if it would help Billy Tanner. "Perhaps you could ask Mr. Prentice to meet me elsewhere. I could explain the situation regarding Billy." Sheriff Mills nodded. "I'll send him to the schoolhouse at 7 this evening if that suits you." "That would be perfect. Thank you, Sheriff." After he departed, Zara tried to return to her lesson planning, but her thoughts kept straying to the upcoming meeting with Jackson Prentice. She told herself her anticipation was purely about helping a student, but deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. At precisely 7 o'clock, Jackson approached the schoolhouse, wondering why the new schoolteacher wanted to see him. Sheriff Mills had been vague, mentioning only that it concerned the Tanner boy and that Miss Reynolds had specifically requested his presence. The schoolhouse windows glowed with lamplight, and as Jackson climbed the steps, he hesitated. He didn't belong in places of learning any more than he belonged in church. His own education had ended at 12 when his father moved them west following his mother's death. Reading, writing, and basic arithmetic were the extent of his knowledge, and even those skills had grown rusty over the years of solitary work. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing Zara Reynolds. She wore a simple blue dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. "Mr. Prentice," she greeted him with a smile. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." Jackson removed his hat as he entered, feeling oversized and out of place among the small desks and educational charts that lined the walls. A blackboard at the front of the room displayed carefully written sentences in chalk. "Sheriff Mills said you wanted to see me about Billy Tanner," he said, getting straight to the point. "Yes." Zara gestured to a chair near her desk, but Jackson remained standing. "Billy hasn't been attending school. His father says he refuses, claiming he doesn't need book learning to be a blacksmith." "He's probably right about that," Jackson said, then regretted his words when her expression fell. "Mr. Prentice, surely you understand the value of education. Not just for practical purposes, but for the enrichment of one's life." Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose. The real issue," Zara continued, "is that Billy can't read and he's embarrassed. I've offered to tutor him privately, but Sheriff Mills thought you might help convince him to accept my assistance. Apparently, the boy looks up to you." Jackson was surprised by this. He'd done some work for Tanner a few times, had shown Billy a few tricks with a lasso once, but he hadn't realized he'd made an impression on the boy. "What would you want me to say to him?" Simply that learning to read isn't something to be ashamed of, that it's never too late. She hesitated. The sheriff mentioned you're leaving town soon. If you could speak with Billy before you go, I would be very grateful. Jackson studied her for a moment. There was a sincerity in her eyes that was uncommon in his experience. Most people wanted something from him: protection, tracking, labor. Miss Reynolds wanted only what was best for a boy who wasn't even her kin. "I'll talk to him," he found himself saying. "Tomorrow morning before I leave." Her face lit up. "Thank you, Mr. Prentice, truly." As she walked him to the door, Jackson felt compelled to explain his earlier comment. "I didn't mean to suggest education isn't important. It's just not everyone has the opportunity." Zara looked at him thoughtfully. "If you don't mind my asking, how far did your own schooling go?" "Not far," he admitted. "My mother taught me to read and write. After she passed, there wasn't much time for books." "I'm sorry about your mother," she said softly. Then, with a directness that surprised him, "Is that why you don't attend church? Because of your loss?" Jackson stiffened. "My reasons are my own, Miss Reynolds, of course." "I apologize for prying." She opened the door. "Good night, Mr. Prentice, and thank you again for your help with Billy." He nodded and stepped outside, settling his hat back on his head. As he walked away from the schoolhouse, he cursed himself for being curt with her. Her question had hit too close to the mark, stirring up memories he preferred to keep buried. It wasn't just his mother's death that had turned him away from church. It was what came after his father's desperate prayers going unanswered, as drought killed their crops, as sickness took their livestock, as debts mounted and despair set in. Jackson had watched his father kneel night after night, begging for divine intervention that never came. "God doesn't listen to the likes of us, boy," his father had finally declared one bitter winter night. "We're on our own in this world." And they had been. His father had drunk himself to an early grave, leaving 17-year-old Jackson to make his own way. Prayer hadn't saved either of them, so Jackson had stopped trying. He relied on his own hands, his own skills, his own judgment. It had kept him alive this far. Yet as he made his way to the saloon for what would likely be his last night in Shoshone City, Jackson found himself wondering what it would be like to have faith like Zara Reynolds clearly did, a faith that illuminated her from within and gave purpose to her days. The next morning, true to his word, Jackson sought out Billy Tanner at the blacksmith shop. The boy was pumping the bellows for his father, his face streaked with soot, his expression sullen. "Billy," Jackson called. "Got a minute?" The boy looked up, surprise and admiration crossing his features. "Mr. Prentice." "Yes, sir." Jackson jerked his head toward the door, and Billy followed him outside after a nod from his father. "Heard you've been skipping school," Jackson said without preamble. Billy scuffed his boot in the dirt. "Don't need it. I'm going to be a blacksmith like Pa." "Even blacksmiths need to read," Jackson pointed out. "How else you going to order supplies, keep track of your accounts, make sure customers pay what they owe? Pa manages." "Your pa can read, Billy. He just pretends he can't because he's not very good at it, but he knows enough." The boy looked up, startled. "How'd you know that?" "Because I've seen him with order forms, and because I understand being embarrassed about something that seems to come easy to others." Billy's expression turned curious. "You do?" Jackson nodded, deciding to take a risk. "I don't read as well as I should either. Never had much schooling. Been times it's cost me jobs I couldn't take, agreements I didn't fully understand." "Really?" Billy seemed genuinely shocked. "But you know everything about tracking and shooting and horses. That's different." "Those things I learned by doing, by watching. Reading, that takes practice, and I didn't practice enough." Jackson put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Miss Reynolds has offered to help you catch up without the other kids knowing. That's a generous offer, and a smart man would take it." Billy considered this. You think I could learn, even now? I know you could. You're a quick study with the forge, I've seen that myself. Would you? Billy hesitated. Would you maybe want to learn more too? Maybe Miss Reynolds could teach us both. The question caught Jackson off guard. His first instinct was to refuse, to explain that he was leaving town, that he had no need for book learning at this stage of his life. But something stopped him, perhaps the hopeful look in Billy's eyes, or the memory of Zara's earnest belief in education's value. I'm not staying in Shoshone City, he said finally. But how about this? I'll sit in on your first lesson with Miss Reynolds. If you decide to keep going after that, I'll bring you something special when I pass through town next month. Billy grinned. A hunting knife. Pa won't let me have one yet. If your father agrees and if Miss Reynolds gives a good report of your progress, yes, a hunting knife. Then it's a deal. The boy stuck out his soot-covered hand, and Jackson shook it solemnly. Go on back to work now. I'll talk to Miss Reynolds about starting today before I leave tomorrow. As Billy ran back to the forge, Jackson stood for a moment, wondering what he'd just committed to. One lesson wouldn't hurt, he reasoned, and it would help the boy overcome his embarrassment. That was all that mattered. He found Zara at the schoolhouse during the noon recess, supervising children playing in the yard. When she saw him approaching, she excused herself from a group of girls playing jacks and met him at the fence. Mr. Prentice, she greeted him. Did you speak with Billy? I did. He's willing to try the lessons on one condition. Jackson cleared his throat. He wants me to join him, at least for the first one. Zara's eyebrows rose. You? But I thought I'm not staying in town, Jackson clarified quickly. But I told him I'd sit in on the first lesson. Seems to think if I'm there, it won't be so embarrassing for him. I see. She studied him with those perceptive green eyes. And would this lesson be for Billy's benefit alone, or might you gain something from it as well? Jackson felt exposed under her gaze. My reading's not what it could be, he admitted reluctantly. But that's not why I'm doing this. It's for the boy. Zara nodded, but there was a knowing look in her eye that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Could you both come to the schoolhouse at 6 this evening? We could have our first lesson then. We'll be there, Jackson promised. As he walked away, he wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd planned to leave town tomorrow to head north for a job guarding a mining company's payroll. Now he was committing to an evening of education with a schoolteacher who already asked too many questions and saw too much. When evening came, Jackson found himself sitting uncomfortably at a desk meant for someone half his size, with Billy beside him looking equally awkward but somewhat reassured by Jackson's presence. Zara Reynolds moved gracefully around the classroom, lighting additional lamps as the daylight faded. I thought we'd start with some basic reading assessments, she said, placing books in front of each of them. Just to see where you are. Billy shot a panicked look at Jackson, who nodded encouragingly. Go on, boy. No shame in starting where you are. For the next hour, Zara guided them through increasingly difficult passages, gently identifying areas that needed work. To Jackson's surprise, he remembered more than he'd expected. His reading was rusty but functional. Billy struggled more but showed a quickness of mind that suggested he would improve rapidly with regular lessons. You both did very well, Zara said as they finished. Billy, if you can come 3 evenings a week, I believe you'll be ready to join the regular class by Christmas. The boy nodded, his initial embarrassment now replaced with determination. I can do that, Miss Reynolds. Excellent. And Mr. Prentice, she turned to Jackson. For someone with limited formal education, your reading skills are quite good. With a bit of practice, you could become truly proficient. Jackson felt an unexpected surge of pride at her assessment. Thank you, madam, but as I mentioned, I won't be staying in town. Of course, she hesitated. But perhaps, when you return next month to check on Billy's progress, we might continue where we left off." The invitation surprised him. "You'd be willing to teach me as well?" "I would be happy to. Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn, regardless of age or circumstance." There was something in her expression, a sincerity and lack of judgment that touched Jackson deeply. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him anything without expecting immediate payment or service in return. "I'll consider it," he said, unwilling to commit but equally unwilling to refuse outright. After Billy departed, Jackson lingered, feeling he should thank her properly. "What you're doing for the boy, it's a good thing," he said. "Not many would take the extra time." "Teaching is my calling," she replied simply. "I believe education can change lives. Even mine." The question slipped out before he could stop it. Zara looked at him thoughtfully. "Especially yours, Mr. Prentice. You strike me as a man with untapped potential." Jackson wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever suggested he could be more than what he was: a competent gun hand, a reliable tracker, a solitary drifter. "Why did you become a teacher?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I've always loved learning," she said. "And I wanted to share that love with others. Knowledge opens doors, creates opportunities." She smiled. "But I suspect there's another reason you're asking." "What's that?" "You're wondering why I left Boston for a place like Shoshone City. Why I would choose a small frontier town over the comforts and culture of the East." Jackson nodded, impressed by her perception. "The thought had crossed my mind." Zara moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "I needed a fresh start, and I believed I could make a difference here. In Boston, I was one of countless educated young women. Here, I can help shape the future of an entire community." There was something she wasn't saying. Jackson could sense it in the slight tension of her shoulders, the careful choice of words, but he had no right to press for more. "Well, Shoshone City's lucky to have you," he said, reaching for his hat. "I should be going. Got an early start tomorrow." "Will you really return to check on Billy's progress?" she asked as he headed for the door. Jackson paused. "I gave the boy my word I'll be back in a month." "Then I look forward to seeing you again, Mr. Prentice." As he stepped out into the evening air, Jackson found himself already anticipating his return to Shoshone City in a way he never had before. Usually, towns were just stopping points, places to rest and resupply before moving on. Now, for the first time in years, he had a reason to come back. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. The month that followed was typical for Jackson: long days of hard, solitary work guarding the mining company's shipments, sleeping under the stars more often than not, and keeping to himself, except when the job required interaction. Yet his thoughts frequently strayed to Shoshone City, to Billy Tanner's progress, and most of all, to Zara Reynolds. He found himself picking up discarded newspapers in mining camps, practicing his reading in private moments. Once, he even purchased a small book of poetry from a traveling salesman, though he'd never had much interest in verse before. The salesman had recommended it as something the ladies enjoy, and Jackson had bought it before he could question his own motives. Meanwhile, in Shoshone City, Zara threw herself into her teaching duties. Billy Tanner proved an apt pupil once his initial embarrassment wore off, and within 2 weeks, his reading had improved remarkably. He now eagerly awaited their evening sessions, and had even begun helping his father with the written aspects of the blacksmith business. "Pa says I'm saving him money already," Billy announced proudly during one lesson. He used to have Mr. Simmons at the bank read the supply catalogs to him, and Mr. Simmons always charged a fee. "That's wonderful, Billy," Zara replied, genuinely pleased with his progress. "Your father must be very proud." "He is." The boy hesitated. Miss Reynolds, do you think Mr. Prentice will really come back like he said? To check on me? I believe he will. Mr. Prentice strikes me as a man who keeps his promises. He's the best tracker in the territory, Billy said with boyish admiration. Pa says if Mr. Prentice can't find something, it can't be found. Is that so? Zara had heard stories about Jackson's skills but had assumed some were exaggerated. Yes, madam. He found the Wilsons' daughter last spring when she got lost in that big storm. Everyone else had given up, said she couldn't have survived the cold, but Mr. Prentice tracked her for 3 days and brought her home safe. Zara was touched by this story. It aligned with her own impressions of Jackson, a man who might keep to himself, but who possessed a strong sense of responsibility toward others. As the weeks passed, she found herself watching the road into town more often than she cared to admit. Though she told herself it was professional interest in Billy's mentor, Zara knew there was more to it. Something about Jackson Prentice had captured her attention in a way no man had before, not even her former fiancé. Perhaps it was the contrast between his rugged exterior and the glimpses of thoughtfulness she'd witnessed. Or maybe it was the sadness she sometimes caught in his eyes, a loneliness that echoed her own despite their different circumstances. Whatever the reason, Zara found herself counting the days until the month would be up, and Jackson might return as promised. Exactly 1 month after his departure, Jackson rode into Shoshone City as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street. Shadow was tired from the journey, and Jackson himself was dusty and in need of a bath and a hot meal. But his first stop wasn't the hotel or the restaurant, it was the blacksmith shop. He found Billy hammering out a horseshoe under his father's watchful eye. When the boy spotted him, his face lit up. "Mr. Prentice?" "You came back. Said I would, didn't I?" Jackson dismounted, leading Shadow into the shade. "How's the reading coming along?" "Real good. Miss Reynolds says I'm learning faster than anyone she's ever taught." "And look," Billy ran to a small desk in the corner of the forge and returned with a ledger. "I'm keeping Pa's accounts now, all by myself." Jackson examined the neat columns of figures and clearly written descriptions. "This is impressive work, Billy. You've made amazing progress." Mr. Tanner approached, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "We're mighty grateful for what you did, Prentice. Got the boy past his pride. Miss Reynolds has done the rest." "Speaking of Miss Reynolds," Jackson said, trying to sound casual, "I should check in with her. Let her know I'm making good on my promise to the boy." "She'll be at the schoolhouse now," Billy said. "We finished early today because of the harvest festival tomorrow." Jackson nodded, turning to Mr. Tanner. "Mind looking after my horse for a bit? He could use some water and rest." "Glad to." "And Prentice," the blacksmith lowered his voice, "you're welcome at our table tonight if you've a mind for a home-cooked meal." "Thank you. I might take you up on that." As Jackson walked toward the schoolhouse, he realized he was nervous. The feeling was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He'd faced armed men, dangerous animals, and treacherous terrain without this fluttering sensation in his stomach. What was it about a schoolteacher that unsettled him so? The schoolhouse door was open, and Jackson could hear Zara's voice inside, reading aloud. He paused on the steps, listening to the clear, expressive way she brought the words to life. It was a story about a journey, about discovery and courage. Jackson found himself drawn in, reluctant to interrupt. When she finished and the children began gathering their things to leave, Jackson stepped into the doorway. Zara looked up, and the smile that spread across her face at the sight of him sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Mr. Prentice," she said, rising from her desk, "you've returned." "As promised," he replied, suddenly aware of the curious stares from the departing children. Once the last student had left, Zara approached him. Billy has made remarkable progress. You should be very proud of your part in that. I just gave him a push. You did the real work. Nevertheless, your influence was crucial. She studied him for a moment. Will you be staying in town long? A few days. I've got another job lined up, but there's time before I need to be there. Jackson hesitated. I thought if you were willing, I might take another reading lesson or two. Her eyes brightened. I would be delighted, and as it happens, I have no other evening lessons scheduled this week. Billy has joined the regular class for reading, though we continue some advanced work after hours. He showed me the accounts he's keeping for his father. Impressive work. Yes, he has a natural aptitude once his embarrassment was overcome. Zara began gathering her teaching materials. Are you attending the Harvest Festival tomorrow? Wasn't planning on it, Jackson admitted. Not much for town celebrations. Oh. She tried to hide her disappointment, but Jackson caught it in her voice. Though I suppose I could make an appearance, he found himself saying, if it's important to the community. Zara looked up, her expression brightening again. It is, and it can be quite enjoyable. There's music, dancing, plenty of food. The children perform a small pageant I've been helping them prepare. Then I'll be there, Jackson promised, wondering why he was committing to an event he would normally avoid at all costs. Wonderful. Now about your reading lesson, would this evening suit you? Perhaps 7 o'clock. 7 would be fine. I should get cleaned up first, been on the trail for days. Of course, she hesitated. I'm very glad you came back, Mr. Prentice. The simple sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. So am I, Miss Reynolds. As he walked back toward the hotel, Jackson realized it was true. He was glad to be back in Shoshone City, not just to fulfill his promise to Billy, but because for the first time in years, he felt a connection to a place and its people, particularly one person. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. That evening, freshly bathed and wearing his cleanest shirt, Jackson returned to the schoolhouse for his reading lesson. Zara had prepared a selection of materials, ranging from newspapers to short stories to practical documents like contracts and land deeds. I thought we might focus on practical reading first, she explained. The kind of text you're likely to encounter in your work. Then, if you're interested, we could explore literature as well. Practical sounds good, Jackson agreed, though his eyes strayed to the small volume of poetry on her desk, similar to the one he'd purchased, but not yet found the courage to read. They worked for over an hour, with Zara patiently guiding him through the complexities of legal language in contracts. Jackson was surprised to discover he had a natural aptitude for deciphering such documents once he understood the patterns. You have an analytical mind, Zara observed. You see connections quickly. Just need to know what I'm signing, Jackson said with a shrug. Been burned before by not understanding the fine print. As the lesson continued, their conversation gradually shifted from reading to more personal topics. Jackson found himself telling Zara about his recent job guarding the mining payroll, describing the rugged beauty of the northern mountains and the characters he'd encountered along the way. In turn, Zara shared stories of her students' progress and the challenges of adapting Eastern teaching methods to Western realities. Some of these children have practical knowledge that would astonish my former professors, she said with a laugh. 10-year-olds who can predict weather changes with more accuracy than any barometer, who understand animal husbandry and crop rotation in ways I never will. Different kind of education, Jackson agreed, but they need what you're teaching them too. World's changing fast. Yes, it is. Zara looked at him thoughtfully. Have you ever considered how your life might change, Mr. Prentice, if you weren't always moving from place to place? The question caught him off guard. Can't say that I have. This life is all I know. But surely you must think about the future sometimes. About growing older, perhaps having a family, Jackson shifted uncomfortably. A man in my line of work doesn't plan too far ahead. Each job could be the last. That sounds very lonely, Zara said softly. It's simpler that way. Jackson stood abruptly. It's getting late, I should go. Zara rose as well, regret in her eyes. I've overstepped. Please forgive me. It's a teacher's habit to ask questions, to probe beneath the surface. Nothing to forgive, Jackson said, though her questions had unsettled him. Same time tomorrow night, if you wish. Though perhaps we should meet earlier since you'll be attending the festival during the day. Right, the festival. Jackson had almost forgotten his promise. How about 4 o'clock then? 4 would be perfect. She walked him to the door. Good night, Mr. Prentice. And thank you for the lesson. I think I'm the one who's supposed to thank you, he said with a half smile. Teaching is a two-way street, Zara replied. I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. As Jackson walked back to the hotel, he pondered her words about loneliness and the future. He'd never allowed himself to consider alternatives to his solitary existence. The idea of putting down roots, of forming permanent connections, it had always seemed impossible, even dangerous. Attachments meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could get a man killed in his line of work. Yet for the first time, he found himself wondering what it might be like to have something permanent, someone permanent. The thought both terrified and tantalized him. The next day dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the harvest festival. The entire town seemed to have turned out for the celebration, with Main Street transformed by decorations, food stalls, and a large area cleared for dancing. Children ran excitedly between the attractions, while adults greeted neighbors and caught up on news. Jackson felt conspicuously out of place as he made his way through the crowd. Several people nodded in recognition: the blacksmith, the sheriff, the general store owner, but most kept their distance. His reputation as a loner preceded him. He spotted Zara supervising a group of children in harvest-themed costumes near the makeshift stage. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep green that matched her eyes, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was partially up, with auburn curls framing her face. Jackson found himself staring, unable to look away until Billy Tanner's voice broke his trance. Mr. Prentice, you came. The boy ran up to him, dressed as what appeared to be a pumpkin. Are you staying for our pageant? Wouldn't miss it, Jackson assured him, tearing his eyes away from Zara. You make a convincing pumpkin. Billy grimaced. Miss Reynolds said we all had to take part. I wanted to be a hunter, but Jeremy Gibson got that part. Well, can't have a harvest without pumpkins, Jackson reasoned, making the boy smile reluctantly. I suppose not. Oh, Miss Reynolds is looking this way. I think she saw you. Indeed, Zara had noticed Jackson and was making her way toward them, navigating through the crowd of excited children. Mr. Prentice, she greeted him warmly. I'm so glad you could join us. Billy, we need you with the other vegetables now. The pageant starts in 15 minutes. After Billy ran off, Zara turned to Jackson. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't really your kind of gathering. I said I would be here, he replied simply. Yes, you did. Her smile deepened. Would you like to watch the pageant from the front? I've saved a space. Jackson followed her to the viewing area, uncomfortably aware of the curious and sometimes disapproving glances from townspeople. Sheriff Mills caught his eye from across the crowd and gave an approving nod, which somehow made things both better and worse. The children's pageant was a simple but charming retelling of the first Thanksgiving, with additional elements celebrating the local harvest. Billy performed his role as a pumpkin with remarkable dignity, and when it was over, the town applauded enthusiastically. As the afternoon continued, Jackson found himself drawn further into the celebration than he'd intended. He sampled pies at the baking contest, voting for Mrs. Tanner's apple creation, watched the horse races, offering professional commentary that earned him respect from several ranchers, and even purchased a carved wooden figure from the charity auction benefiting the school. Throughout it all, Zara flitted in and out of his awareness supervising activities, chatting with parents, occasionally catching his eye across the crowd and smiling in a way that made his heart beat faster. Jackson couldn't remember the last time he'd participated in a community event rather than observing from the margins. The feeling was strange but not entirely unpleasant. As evening approached, lanterns were lit, and the band began playing for dancing. Jackson retreated to the edge of the gathering, content to watch as couples took to the cleared area in front of the band. "Not much of a dancer?" Sheriff Mills asked, appearing beside him with 2 mugs of cider. Jackson accepted one with a nod of thanks. "Never learned. Shame." "Miss Reynolds seems to be without a partner." Following the sheriff's gaze, Jackson saw Zara standing with Mrs. Hollister, watching the dancers. She looked beautiful in the lantern light, her expression wistful. "Don't you start matchmaking, Mills," Jackson warned. "I'm leaving town in a few days." "Are you? Seems to me you've been finding more reasons to come back lately." Mills sipped his cider thoughtfully. "Town could use a man with your skills on a permanent basis. Deputy position still open." "I work alone, you know that." "A man can change, Prentice, when he has reason to." Before Jackson could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the festival. Raised voices and the sound of breaking glass drew their attention. Sheriff Mills sighed. "Hendricks brothers. Should have known they'd cause trouble. Excuse me." As the sheriff headed toward the disturbance, Jackson noticed Zara also moving in that direction, apparently concerned about some of her students who were nearby. Without thinking, he followed, a protective instinct taking over. The Hendricks brothers, 3 rough-looking men Jackson recognized as ranch hands from the double-bar outfit, were clearly drunk and becoming belligerent with the festival organizers who had asked them to leave. "We got as much right to be here as anyone." The eldest brother slurred, pushing away a town council member who tried to intervene. Sheriff Mills stepped in, hand on his holster. "That's enough, Hendricks. You boys are drunk. Time to call it a night." "Says who?" the middle brother challenged, his hand drifting toward his own gun. Jackson moved swiftly, positioning himself between the brewing confrontation and where Zara stood with several frightened children. She met his eyes briefly, understanding and gratitude in her expression as she began herding the children away from danger. The situation escalated quickly. The youngest Hendricks brother threw a punch at Sheriff Mills, who dodged it and tried to restrain him. The other brothers jumped in, and suddenly it was a full-fledged brawl, with festival goers scrambling to get out of the way. Jackson stayed back, keeping himself between the fight and the retreating townsfolk, until he saw the eldest Hendricks pull a knife. Without hesitation, he moved in, catching the man's wrist before he could use the weapon and twisting until he dropped it. "Back off," Jackson said quietly, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. Something in his tone or expression must have penetrated the man's alcohol-fueled rage, because he stepped back, hands raised. His brothers, seeing this, also ceased struggling against the sheriff and the deputies who had arrived to help. "Get them to the jail to sleep it off," Sheriff Mills ordered his men. Then to Jackson, "Thanks for the assist, could have turned ugly." "Just happened to be close by," Jackson said, brushing off the gratitude. As the Hendricks brothers were led away and the crowd began to settle, Jackson looked around for Zara. He spotted her comforting a crying child, her expression calm and reassuring despite the chaos moments before. When the child had been reunited with her parents, Zara approached Jackson. "That was very brave," she said. "Though I suspect for you it was just another day." "Wasn't much," he replied, uncomfortable with her praise. "Sheriff had it under control." "Nevertheless, you acted quickly to protect others." She glanced at the dancing area, where the band had resumed playing as if nothing had happened. "The festival continues, it seems." "Folks out here don't let a little trouble ruin a good time," Jackson observed. Zara smiled. "No, they don't." She hesitated. "Would you, that is, I know you said you don't dance, but perhaps you might like to try." With me, the invitation caught him completely off guard. "I'd step all over your feet," he warned. "I'm willing to risk it," she said, her eyes sparkling with challenge. And somehow, before he could think of a reasonable excuse, Jackson found himself being led to the dance floor by Zara Reynolds. The band was playing something slow, for which he was grateful. Zara positioned his hand at her waist, took his other hand in hers, and began guiding him in a simple box step. "See, you're a natural," she encouraged as he cautiously followed her lead. "Don't know about that," he muttered, intensely aware of her proximity, the scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the warmth of her hand in his. "Just relax and feel the music," she suggested. "Don't think too much." Jackson tried to follow her advice, gradually becoming more comfortable with the movements. He was acutely conscious of the stares they were attracting the town's schoolteacher dancing with the infamous loner, but Zara seemed oblivious or unconcerned. "Why did you really come back to Shoshone City, Mr. Prentice?" she asked softly as they moved around the floor. "Told you, made a promise to the boy." "Yes, but you could have sent the knife you promised him. You didn't need to deliver it personally." Jackson met her gaze, finding he couldn't look away. "Maybe I had other reasons, such as," the directness of her question deserved an equally direct answer. "Maybe I wanted to see you again." A blush spread across her cheeks, visible even in the lantern light. "I'm glad," she said simply. They continued dancing, and Jackson gradually relaxed enough to look around. Sheriff Mills raised his glass in a toast from the sidelines. Billy Tanner, freed from his pumpkin costume, was watching with undisguised amazement. Most of the townspeople seemed surprised but not disapproving except for Mrs. Hollister, whose pursed lips suggested she found the pairing inappropriate. As the song ended, Jackson reluctantly released Zara. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally. "Will you still come for your reading lesson tomorrow?" she asked. "Even after all the excitement today, if you're still willing to teach me." "More willing than ever," she assured him, and the warmth in her voice stayed with him long after they parted ways for the evening. The next day brought rain, a steady autumn downpour that turned Shoshone City's streets to mud and kept most residents indoors. Jackson spent the morning maintaining his equipment at the hotel, then ventured out to purchase the promised hunting knife for Billy. The boy's father had grudgingly approved the gift after Jackson assured him he would teach Billy proper safety and respect for the tool. By 4 o'clock, when Jackson made his way to the schoolhouse, the rain had settled into a gentle patter on the roof. The building was warm and dry, with lamps already lit against the gray afternoon. Zara greeted him with a smile that seemed to brighten the room more than the lamps ever could. "I wasn't sure you'd come, given the weather," she said, taking his wet coat. "Said I would," Jackson replied as if that explained everything. And for him, it did. The lesson began as before, with practical reading exercises. But something had shifted between them since the dance. There was an awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that went beyond teacher and student. When Zara leaned close to help him decipher a particularly complex passage in a land deed, Jackson caught the scent of lavender again and found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the words before him. "You seem distracted today," she observed after he misread the same line twice. Sorry. Just thinking. About what? Jackson hesitated, then decided on honesty. About how I'm leaving tomorrow, and about how, for the first time I can remember, I'm not looking forward to it. Zara's expression softened. Because of our lessons. Because of you, he said simply. You make me think about things I've been avoiding for years, like having a place to belong, people who matter. And that frightens you, terrifies me, he admitted with a rueful smile. I've been alone so long, I don't know how to be anything else. Zara placed her hand over his. No one is meant to be alone forever, Jackson. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it sent a jolt through him. Some men are better off that way, safer. Safer, perhaps, but not happier. Her eyes held his. Will you come back again, after your next job? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Jackson knew he should make no promises. His life was unpredictable, dangerous. Attachments were a liability, yet he found himself saying, "Yes, if you want me to, I do," she replied softly. "Very much." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain tapping gently on the roof, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Zara said finally. "Something personal." Jackson tensed slightly but nodded for her to continue. "Why don't you pray?" "I've noticed you never attend church, never bow your head before meals. Is it because you don't believe, or because you're angry with God?" The question hit him like a physical blow. No one had asked him so directly before. Most people in the West minded their own business when it came to matters of faith. But Zara, with her minister father and Eastern upbringing, saw the world differently. "Both, I suppose," he answered after a long pause. "Saw too many good people suffer while the wicked prospered. Watched my father pray every day for relief that never came." His voice hardened. "If there is a God, he doesn't listen to men like me." Zara didn't immediately counter with platitudes or arguments as he'd expected. Instead, she considered his words thoughtfully. "I understand why you would feel that way," she said finally. "Faith can be difficult to maintain in the face of suffering, but I wonder, have you ever considered that prayer isn't just about asking for things? That it might be about connection, about knowing you're not alone in the universe?" Jackson shook his head. "Never saw it that way. My father used to say that prayer is a conversation, not a transaction, that even when it seems no one is listening, the act of reaching out has value." She smiled sadly. "Of course, it's easier to believe that when you haven't endured what you have." Her understanding, her willingness to acknowledge his experience rather than dismiss it, touched Jackson deeply. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is, though we've had our disagreements." She looked down at their hands, still touching on the table. "He didn't approve of my coming west, thought I was running away from disappointment rather than toward purpose." "Were you? Running away, I mean." Zara met his gaze. "Perhaps at first. I'd been engaged to a man in Boston, a lawyer from a good family. He broke the engagement when a better match presented itself. A woman with more money, more social connections." "Fool," Jackson said immediately. Her laugh was soft and surprised. "That's kind of you to say. Just the truth." He couldn't imagine any man choosing wealth or status over Zara's intelligence, compassion, and beauty. "Well, his decision led me here, so perhaps I should be grateful." She squeezed his hand gently. "I've found purpose in Shoshone City, and unexpected connections." The way she looked at him made Jackson's heart race. He knew he should pull away, maintain distance. Instead, he found himself leaning closer. "Zara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not the kind of man you shouldn't I be the judge of that?" She interrupted, her eyes never leaving his. And then, before he could form a logical argument, before he could remind himself of all the reasons this was a terrible idea, Jackson was kissing her. or she was kissing him. He wasn't entirely sure who had closed the final distance between them, only that her lips were soft and warm against his, and that nothing in his 30 years of life had prepared him for this feeling. The kiss was brief but profound. When they parted, Zara's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. Jackson felt simultaneously more alive and more vulnerable than he ever had. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "I'm glad you did," she replied, "though I suppose it complicates matters." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, struggling to think clearly. "I'm still leaving tomorrow, still have a job to do." "I know," she straightened, composing herself, "and I have responsibilities here. But perhaps when you return we could explore whatever this is between us." The sensible thing would be to end it now, to walk away cleanly before either of them became more invested. But Jackson found he couldn't bear the thought. "When I return," he agreed, the promise feeling both terrifying and right. They finished the lesson in a state of heightened awareness, both trying to focus on the words on the page rather than what had just transpired between them. When it was time for Jackson to leave, he did so reluctantly. "Be careful," Zara said as she handed him his coat. "Whatever this job is, come back safely." "I will," he promised. Then, impulsively, he added, "Would you write to me? I could send letters to the general store in Billings. I pass through there regularly." Her face lit up. "I would love to." As Jackson stepped out into the rain, he felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his world. The solitary path he had walked for so long now seemed to be veering toward unexpected territory, toward connection, toward possibility, toward Zara. It was the most frightening and exhilarating feeling he had ever known. The weeks that followed were transformative for both Jackson and Zara. Though separated by distance, their connection deepened through letters exchanged whenever possible. Jackson's job guarding a cattle drive took him through dangerous territory, but each night as he sat by the campfire, he would practice his reading with Zara's letters and work on crafting his replies. His first few letters were brief and functional, focusing on the practical details of his journey. But as time passed and Zara's warm, thoughtful responses arrived, Jackson found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He described the landscapes he traveled through, the challenges of the trail, and increasingly, his thoughts and feelings about his life and future. For Zara, the correspondence became a cherished ritual. She wrote in the evenings after her teaching duties were complete, sharing stories of her students' progress, town happenings, and her own reflections. Through writing, she revealed more of herself than she might have in person: her doubts about leaving Boston, her determination to make a difference in Shoshone City, and her growing feelings for a certain cowboy who had unexpectedly captured her heart. In late November, nearly 2 months after Jackson's departure, a letter arrived that made Zara's heart race. Miss Reynolds' job finished successfully. Heading back to Shoshone City. Should arrive by month's end, weather permitting. Been thinking about what you said regarding prayer. Still can't bring myself to do it proper, but find myself talking to the stars at night. Don't know if anyone's listening, but the talking helps somehow. Looking forward to seeing you again. Yours, Jackson. The signature, yours, and the mention of prayer filled Zara with hope. She reread the short note countless times, tucking it into her Bible at night. 2 days before Thanksgiving, with snow threatening in the gray sky overhead, Jackson rode into Shoshone City. He was leaner than when he'd left, his face more weathered from weeks on the trail. But as he approached the schoolhouse just as children were being dismissed for the day, there was a lightness in his spirit that had been absent for years. Zara stood on the steps, bidding farewell to her students. When she spotted him, her face transformed with joy. She maintained her composure until the last child had departed, then hurried toward him as he dismounted. They stood facing each other, suddenly shy despite months of intimate letters. "You're back," she said simply, drinking in the sight of him. "Said I would be," he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "You look tired. Long ride." He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. "Worth it, though." Zara blushed, squeezing his hand in return. "The Tanners are hosting Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow. They've invited us both." "Us?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Together?" "Yes, it seems our friendship hasn't gone unnoticed." She looked down briefly. "If you'd rather not know," he interrupted, "I'd like to go with you." Her smile was radiant. "I'm glad, very glad." They walked together toward the hotel where Jackson would be staying, Shadow following behind. Their conversation flowed easily, picking up threads from their letters, filling in details that couldn't be captured on paper. "How's Billy doing with that knife?" Jackson asked. "Very responsibly, I'm pleased to say. He's become quite skilled at whittling, made a beautiful set of animals for the younger children's classroom. Good boy. I knew he'd take it seriously. He asks about you constantly," Zara said with a smile. "I think he's trying to decide if he wants to be a blacksmith like his father or a tracker like you when he grows up." Jackson looked surprised. "Never thought of myself as someone a kid would look up to." "You'd be surprised how many people in town respect you, Jackson, more than you realize." As they reached the hotel, Jackson reluctantly released her hand. "Dinner tonight, after I've cleaned up." "I'd like that," Zara agreed. "The restaurant at the hotel is quite good. 7 o'clock, I'll be here." As Zara walked back to her boarding house, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Jackson was back, and the connection they'd built through letters seemed to have translated into person. Tomorrow, they would attend Thanksgiving dinner together, almost like a proper couple. But a nagging worry remained. Jackson's life was still transient, still dangerous. How could they build something lasting when his nature and profession kept him constantly on the move? And would the town, particularly those like Mrs. Hollister, who strictly maintained propriety, accept a relationship between their schoolteacher and a man known primarily for his skill with a gun? These questions troubled her as she prepared for dinner that evening. Yet when she saw Jackson waiting for her in the hotel lobby, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with his best vest, her concerns momentarily faded. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thanksgiving dinner at the Tanner home was a boisterous affair. Besides Jackson and Zara, the blacksmith had invited several other families, including Sheriff Mills and his wife. The table groaned under the weight of the feast: a huge turkey, mashed potatoes, cornbread stuffing, and pies of every description. Jackson felt out of place at first, unaccustomed to family gatherings. But Billy's enthusiasm and Zara's comforting presence beside him gradually eased his discomfort. By the time Mrs. Tanner asked everyone to join hands for the blessing, he was relaxed enough to take Zara's hand in his right and Billy's in his left without hesitation. As Mr. Tanner began to pray, Jackson kept his eyes open, watching the others. Their heads were bowed, their expressions peaceful. Zara's lips moved silently along with the prayer, and Jackson found himself wondering what it would be like to have that kind of faith, to believe so completely in something he couldn't see or prove. When the prayer ended and the feast began, conversation flowed easily around the table. Jackson mostly listened, offering comments when directly addressed, but content to observe the easy familiarity of people who had built lives together in this small community. "So, Prentice," Sheriff Mills said as they enjoyed slices of apple and pumpkin pie, "what are your plans now? Moving on soon?" Jackson felt Zara tense slightly beside him. "Not immediately," he replied. Thought I might stay in Shoshone City for a while, if there's work to be had. Always work for a man with your skills, the sheriff said meaningfully. Offer of a deputy position still stands. I'll consider it, Jackson said, surprising himself as much as everyone else at the table. After dinner, as the women cleared the dishes and the men moved to the porch for pipes and conversation despite the cold, Billy cornered Jackson with excitement. Are you really staying, Mr. Prentice? For good, don't know about for good, Jackson hedged. But for a while, yes. Because of Miss Reynolds, the boy asked with surprising perception. Jackson ruffled his hair. That's part of it. She likes you a lot, Billy informed him seriously. She smiles different when she talks about you. Is that so? Jackson couldn't help but smile himself. Yep, and she keeps all your letters in her desk at school. I saw them when I was helping her organize the classroom. This information pleased Jackson more than he cared to admit. Well, I like her a lot too. Are you going to marry her? Billy asked with a child's directness. The question caught Jackson completely off guard. That's we haven't it's complicated, Billy. Why? If you like her and she likes you, seems simple to me. Out of the mouths of babes, Jackson thought. There's more to it than just liking each other. I've lived a certain way for a long time, not sure I know how to be anything else. Billy considered this. My pa says a man can learn anything if he wants it bad enough. When I couldn't read, I thought I'd never learn, but I wanted it, so I tried, and now I can. The simple wisdom hit Jackson with unexpected force. Your pa's a smart man, he said quietly. Inside, Zara was helping Mrs. Tanner wash dishes when the woman brought up the subject that had been on everyone's mind. You and Mr. Prentice seem quite close, she observed, passing Zara a plate to dry. We've become good friends, Zara replied carefully. Mrs. Tanner gave her a knowing look. Friends don't look at each other the way you two do, not that I'm judging, mind you. He's a good man for all his rough edges. Yes, he is, Zara agreed, relief washing over her. Mrs. Tanner's approval meant something. She was respected in the community. Just be patient with him, the older woman advised. Men like that, who have been alone so long they take time to domesticate. Zara laughed. I'm not trying to domesticate him. Maybe not. But if you care for him, and I can see you do, you'll need to give him space to figure out how to fit you into his life. It won't be easy for either of you. I know, Zara said softly, but I believe he's worth waiting for, Mrs. Tanner nodded approvingly. Good. That's the right spirit. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared to leave, Jackson and Zara found themselves momentarily alone in the Tanners' front hallway while the others gathered coats and said goodbyes in the parlor. Thank you for coming with me today, Zara said. It meant a lot. I enjoyed it, Jackson replied, surprised to find it was true. Never had a proper Thanksgiving before. Never, Zara looked shocked. Not since my mother died. My father wasn't one for celebrations. Zara's expression softened with understanding. She reached up, touching his face gently. Then I'm especially glad you shared it with us today. The tenderness in her gesture nearly undid him. Jackson caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek for a moment before releasing it as the others returned. As they walked back toward town through the cold November evening, Jackson offered Zara his arm. She took it, drawing close to his side. Did you mean what you said about considering the deputy position? She asked. I did. He glanced down at her. Would you like me to stay in Shoshone City? You know I would, she admitted, but only if it's what you want to. Jackson was silent for a long moment, considering. Never thought about settling down anywhere. Always figured I'd die on the trail somewhere, alone. That sounds terribly bleak. Just seemed like the natural end to the path I was on. He looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. But lately, I've been thinking there might be other paths. They reached Zara's boarding house too soon. On the porch, shielded from the street by the shadows, Jackson gathered his courage. "Zara," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not good with words, not like you are. But these past months, the letters, seeing you today with the Tanners, it's made me want things I never thought I could have." Her eyes shone in the dim light. "What things?" "A home. A place to belong." He swallowed hard. "Someone to come back to." "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have those things. You deserve them." "Not sure about that, but I want to try." He squeezed her hands. "If you'll be patient with me, I don't know how to do this, how to be what you need." "I don't need you to be anything but yourself," Zara said firmly. "The man who helped Billy when no one else could reach him. The man who writes me letters about talking to the stars. The man who's brave enough to consider a new path." Jackson leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "I can't promise it will be easy, or that I won't make mistakes." "Neither can I," she replied, "but we can figure it out together." When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the hesitant, questioning kiss of their first encounter. This was a promise, a declaration of intent. Zara responded with equal fervor, her arms slipping around his neck as she drew herself closer to him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed irrevocably. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to the solitary existence he had known before. The winter passed in a blur of new experiences for Jackson. He accepted the deputy position, working alongside Sheriff Mills to keep peace in Shoshone City and the surrounding area. Though the job required occasional trips away from town, he always returned within days rather than weeks or months. His relationship with Zara deepened as they spent evenings together, sometimes continuing his reading lessons, sometimes simply talking by the fire at her boarding house, with the door appropriately left open to avoid scandal. On Sundays, though Jackson still didn't attend church services, he began meeting Zara afterward for walks or meals. The townsfolk gradually adjusted to seeing them together. There were some raised eyebrows and whispered comments, particularly from Mrs. Hollister's circle, but most people accepted the pairing with equanimity. Jackson's position as deputy lent him a respectability he hadn't possessed as a drifting hired gun, and Zara's obvious happiness silenced many potential critics. One February evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner at Zara's boarding house, a question that had been on Jackson's mind for weeks finally found voice. "Why are you so set on getting me to pray?" he asked suddenly. "Is it that important to you?" Zara looked up from her book, surprised by the question. "I'm not set on it, as you put it. I just believe it might bring you comfort." "But why does it matter to you? Plenty of men out here don't pray, don't go to church. You don't seem concerned about their souls." She closed her book, giving him her full attention. "Because I care about you, Jackson, more than I've ever cared for anyone. And yes, faith is important to me, it's part of who I am." "So you want me to change, to become someone different?" "No." She moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "I want you to be at peace. You carry so much inside you, so much pain and guilt and loneliness. I've seen how it weighs on you." Jackson stared into the fire. "And you think prayer would fix that?" "Not fix. Nothing can erase the past, but perhaps it could help you carry the burden." She took his hand. "When my mother died, I was 12. I was so angry at God, at the doctors who couldn't save her, at my father for continuing to preach about divine goodness when our family had been shattered." Jackson looked at her with surprise. She had mentioned her mother's death in her letters, but had never spoken of anger or doubt. "What changed?" he asked. "I realized that prayer wasn't just about asking for things, or even about giving thanks. Sometimes it's simply about not being alone in your grief. About acknowledging that there are things beyond our control, beyond our understanding. She squeezed his hand. I don't pray because I expect God to grant my every wish. I pray because it reminds me that I'm part of something larger than myself. Jackson considered her words. I don't know if I can believe the way you do, he admitted. Too much has happened. I'm not asking you to believe exactly as I do, Zara said gently. Faith is a personal journey, but I think your heart is already reaching for something. Why else would you talk to the stars? The observation struck him deeply. She was right. His habit of speaking his thoughts to the night sky was in its own way a form of prayer. Not the formal, church-bound kind, but a reaching out nonetheless. Maybe, he conceded. Then, with a half-smile, you're a patient woman, Zara Reynolds. Only with those worth waiting for, she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. As winter gave way to spring, Jackson became an integral part of Shoshone City. He helped organize a volunteer fire brigade after a close call at the livery stable, taught a group of boys basic tracking skills during their school recess, with Zara's enthusiastic approval, and even attended the Easter social, though he still declined to enter the church for the service beforehand. By May, when wildflowers bloomed across the Montana prairie, Jackson had reached a decision that both terrified and exhilarated him. After consulting with Sheriff Mills and securing his blessing, Jackson rode to the Tanner homestead on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Mr. Tanner was working at his forge when Jackson arrived, Billy assisting him with evident pride in his growing skills. Prentice, the blacksmith, greeted him, setting aside his hammer. What brings you out here? No trouble in town, I hope? No trouble, Jackson assured him, dismounting. Actually, I came to ask a favor, a personal one. Mr. Tanner raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands on his apron. What kind of favor? Jackson glanced at Billy, who was watching with undisguised curiosity. Might need some privacy for this conversation. Understanding dawned on the blacksmith's face. Billy, go help your mother with the garden. She was complaining about those fence posts needing repair. The boy looked disappointed but complied, trotting off toward the vegetable garden behind the house. Once he was out of earshot, Mr. Tanner turned to Jackson expectantly. This about Miss Reynolds, I take it? Yes, sir. Jackson removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. I was hoping you might have some skills with more delicate metalwork than horseshoes. Mr. Tanner grinned broadly. You're wanting a ring, if you're willing. I'd pay fair price, of course. Wouldn't dream of taking your money for this, Prentice. Be an honor. The blacksmith studied him thoughtfully. You're sure about this? Settling down's a big change for a man like you. More sure than I've been about anything, Jackson replied without hesitation. He struggled to find words adequate to express what Zara meant to him. She makes me want to be better than I am. Mr. Tanner nodded approvingly. That's what a good woman does. Doesn't try to change you, just makes you want to change yourself. He gestured toward his workbench. Come on, let's talk design. I've got some silver set aside for special projects. Been saving it for something worthwhile. An hour later, with plans for a simple but elegant ring agreed upon, Jackson prepared to leave. Mr. Tanner walked him to his horse. Give me a week, the blacksmith said. And Prentice, I'm happy for you both. Town's been buzzing about when you'd make it official. Jackson shook his hand gratefully. Appreciate your discretion until I've had a chance to ask her. Of course, though I make no promises about keeping Billy from guessing. Boys sharp as a tack these days, thanks to you and Miss Reynolds. As Jackson rode back to town, his mind was filled with possibilities. If Zara accepted his proposal, and he believed they would need a home of their own. His room above the sheriff's office had been adequate for a bachelor deputy, but it was no place for a wife. Perhaps that small house at the edge of town that had recently become available. His planning was interrupted by the sight of a rider approaching from the direction of Shoshone City, pushing his horse hard. As they drew closer, Jackson recognized one of the young men who worked at the telegraph office. "Deputy Prentice," the rider called, reining in sharply. "Sheriff Mills sent me to find you. There's trouble in town." Jackson's pleasant mood evaporated instantly. "What kind of trouble?" "Hendricks brothers are back, all three of them, plus two more men nobody knows. They've been drinking at the saloon all morning, making threats about settling scores." The young man looked worried. "They mentioned you specifically, and Miss Reynolds." A cold fury settled in Jackson's chest. "Where's the sheriff now?" "Keeping an eye on them at the saloon. Said to tell you to come careful like, not to provoke anything." "And Miss Reynolds?" "Teaching at the school. Sheriff sent word for her to stay there with the children until this is settled." Jackson nodded grimly. "Ride back and tell the sheriff I'm coming. But first stop at the school and make sure Miss Reynolds understands she's to stay put, no matter what she hears." As the messenger galloped back toward town, Jackson checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded. The Hendricks brothers had been a nuisance before, but this sounded more serious. If they were threatening Zara because of her connection to him. He urged Shadow into a gallop, actually praying, for the first time in years, that he would reach town before anything happened to the woman he loved. Zara was in the middle of a geography lesson when the messenger arrived at the schoolhouse, his urgent whispers at the door sending a chill through her. The Hendricks brothers had made no secret of their dislike for Jackson after he'd helped thwart their disruption of the Harvest Festival. But to return to town with reinforcements, making explicit threats, this was something else entirely. "Children," she said, keeping her voice steady, "we're going to have an unexpected indoor recess this afternoon. I'd like you to read quietly at your desks for the next half hour while I attend to some business." Once the children were settled, Zara stepped onto the schoolhouse porch with the messenger. "Where is Deputy Prentice now?" she asked, riding in from the Tanner place. "He said to tell you to stay here, madam, no matter what." Zara nodded, though anxiety knotted her stomach. "Please tell the sheriff we're secure here. I'll keep the children inside until I receive word that it's safe." After the messenger departed, Zara returned to her classroom, maintaining a calm facade for her students while her mind raced with worry. Jackson was skilled and experienced, but 5 against 2 weren't odds anyone would favor. And these men had been drinking, which made them unpredictable and dangerous. In town, Jackson rode directly to the sheriff's office, dismounting and tying Shadow to the hitching post before entering through the back door. Sheriff Mills was waiting, his expression grim. "They're still at the saloon," he reported, getting louder and more belligerent. "Barkeep tried to cut them off, but they threatened to shoot up the place." "What exactly are they saying?" Jackson asked, checking his spare ammunition. "Oldest Hendricks claims you cheated them somehow during that fight at the Harvest Festival. Says you broke his brother's arm when you didn't need to." Mills shook his head. "It's nonsense, of course. Man's arm was barely sprained. But they've convinced themselves you've wronged them and they're looking for payback. And Zara, why involve her? They know she matters to you. Seems to think threatening her will draw you out." The sheriff's expression darkened. "There's more. One of their new friends, a hard case with a southern accent, he's been asking questions around town about you. Specific questions about jobs you've done, men you've killed." Jackson frowned. "Bounty hunter, maybe, or someone with a personal grudge." Either way, this isn't just about the Hendricks' bruised pride anymore. Jackson considered their options. "We could wait them out. They'll either drink themselves unconscious or run out of money eventually. Normally, I'd agree, but they're getting the whole saloon riled up. Might not stay contained there." Mills glanced out the window toward the school, barely visible at the end of the street. "And I don't like them making threats against Miss Reynolds." "Neither do I." Jackson checked his gun one last time. "Let's end this. Direct approach. You and me, both wearing badges, legal and proper. And if they draw," Jackson's expression hardened, "then we finish it." The two lawmen walked side by side down Main Street toward the saloon. Word had spread quickly about the brewing confrontation, and townspeople had cleared the street, watching nervously from doorways and windows. Jackson was acutely aware of how many innocents could be hurt if the situation escalated into a shootout. Inside the saloon, the Hendricks brothers and their companions had commandeered a large table, bottles of whiskey scattered across its surface. The other patrons had retreated to the far corners of the room or slipped out entirely. Only the barkeeper remained at his post, his face tense with worry. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Sheriff Mills said as he and Jackson entered. "Understand you've been causing some concern among the good folks of this establishment." The eldest Hendricks looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Well, look who it is, the law and Prentice." He spat the name like a curse. "Man who thinks he's better than everybody else." "Nobody's saying that," Mills replied evenly. "But you boys are disturbing the peace. Time to settle your bill and move along." "We ain't going nowhere," the middle brother slurred. "Not till we get satisfaction." Jackson kept his hand away from his gun, but his posture was alert, ready. He studied the two strangers at the table, one a lean, hard-faced man with a southern accent who was watching him with calculating eyes, the other a younger man who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Whatever grievance you think you have, this isn't the way to address it," Jackson said calmly. "You're welcome to speak to the judge when he makes his circuit next week." The southern man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Listen to him, boys. All civilized now that he's wearing a badge." He leaned forward. "But I knew him when he wasn't so respectable. Didn't you, Prentice?" Jackson frowned, studying the man more carefully. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but Jackson couldn't place it. "Should I know you?" "Tuscosa. 5 years ago. You were hunting a man named Garrett, my brother." The southern man's voice remained conversational, but his eyes were cold as ice. "You found him, shot him dead." Memory clicked into place. Jackson had tracked a bank robber across 3 territories, finally cornering him in a small Texas town. The man had drawn first, giving Jackson no choice but to fire. It had been a clean kill, legal, justified. But clearly this man didn't see it that way. "Your brother robbed a bank, killed a teller," Jackson said evenly. "Drew on me when I found him. So you say." The southern man, Garrett's brother, smiled thinly. "Been looking for you a long time, Prentice. Almost had you in Colorado last year, but you moved on before I arrived. Then I heard about a former tracker named Prentice settling down in Montana. Imagine my surprise." "Look," Sheriff Mills intervened, "whatever happened in Texas is Texas business. This is Shoshone City, and here we settle things legally." "Like you settled things with my brothers at that festival," the eldest Hendricks demanded, rising unsteadily to his feet. "Humiliated us in front of the whole town. You were drunk and disorderly," Mills replied. "Just like now." The tension in the room was palpable. Jackson could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and bullets would fly. "I've got no quarrel with you, Hendricks," he said, trying to diffuse at least one threat. "What happened at the festival is over and done. You boys were asked to leave because you were causing trouble. That's all." "That ain't all," the youngest Hendricks brother said suddenly. "You've been getting above yourself, Prentice. Acting like you belong here, courting that schoolteacher like you're good enough for her." The mention of Zara ignited something fierce in Jackson's chest, but he kept his voice level. "Miss Reynolds isn't part of this. Leave her out of it. "Oh, but she is part of it," Garrett's brother said smoothly. "She's your weakness, Prentice. Everyone in town can see it." The youngest Hendricks brother, emboldened by alcohol and his companion's support, stood up. "Maybe we should pay the schoolhouse a visit. See what the fancy Eastern lady thinks about her man's real history." "That would be a mistake," Jackson said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Is that a threat?" Garrett's brother asked, his hand drifting toward his gun. "It's a fact," Sheriff Mills answered firmly. "The schoolhouse is off limits. There are children there." "Last chance, gentlemen," Jackson added. "Settle your bill and leave town peacefully, or spend the night in jail for disturbing the peace. Your choice." For a long, tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might resolve without bloodshed. Then the eldest Hendricks, too drunk and angry for reason, reached for his gun. Everything happened in a blur after that. Jackson drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet striking Hendricks in the shoulder before the man could level his weapon. Sheriff Mills had his gun out an instant later, covering the others. "Nobody else move," the sheriff commanded. Garrett's brother had frozen, his hand hovering near his holster. His expression was calculating as he assessed the situation. "Your friend needs medical attention," Jackson said evenly. "And you need to decide if whatever vendetta you're nursing is worth dying for." The Southern man held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly raised his hands. "Another time, perhaps, when there aren't so many complications." The others followed suit, raising their hands in surrender. Sheriff Mills moved forward to disarm them while Jackson kept them covered. "Get the doctor for Hendricks," Mills instructed the barkeeper. "Then help me get these men to the jail." As they marched the subdued troublemakers toward the jailhouse, Jackson felt the town watching. This hadn't been the clean resolution he'd hoped for, but at least no one had died, and Zara had remained safely at the school. Still, Garrett's brother's words echoed in his mind. The man had tracked him across multiple territories, nursed his grudge for years. As long as Jackson remained in Shoshone City, the people he cared about, Zara especially, could become targets. The thought filled him with dread. Just when he'd found a reason to stay, to build something permanent, his past was threatening to tear it all away. After the prisoners were secured and Hendricks was being treated by the doctor, Sheriff Mills pulled Jackson aside. "You're thinking of leaving," he said, not a question but a statement. Jackson looked at him sharply. "How did you know? Seen that look before?" "Man thinking he's a danger to those around him." Mills shook his head. "It would be a mistake, son. That man Garrett's brother, he won't stop, and next time Zara might get caught in the crossfire. So your solution is to what? Go back to drifting? Leave behind the life you've built here?" "Leave her," the sheriff's tone hardened. "That's the coward's way out, Prentice, and I never took you for a coward." The words stung, but Jackson stood his ground. "It's not about courage, it's about protecting her. Did it occur to you that Miss Reynolds might want a say in the matter? That she might consider you worth the risk?" Mills sighed. "Go talk to her, tell her everything. Let her decide with all the facts in front of her. You owe her that much at least." Jackson knew the sheriff was right, though the prospect of confessing his fears to Zara, of potentially watching her realize that loving him meant living with danger, filled him with dread. "I'll speak with her," he promised. "Once we're sure those men are secure." "They're not going anywhere," Mills assured him. "Go now. She's probably worried sick." At the schoolhouse, Zara had dismissed her students early, sending them home with strict instructions to go directly to their parents. Only Billy Tanner remained, having refused to leave until he knew what had happened in town. "My pa would want me to stay and make sure you're safe, Miss Reynolds," he insisted stubbornly. "Until Mr. Prentice comes." Zara didn't have the heart to argue. In truth, She was grateful for the boy's company as the minutes stretched into hours with no word from town. When they finally heard footsteps on the schoolhouse porch, Billy positioned himself protectively in front of her, only relaxing when Jackson appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Prentice," Billy exclaimed, "is everything all right? We heard a gunshot." "Everything's under control now," Jackson assured him, his eyes moving to Zara, drinking in the sight of her safe and unharmed. "The Hendricks brothers and their friends are in jail. No serious injuries." Relief washed over Zara, but she could sense something was wrong. There was a tension in Jackson's shoulders, a guarded look in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "Billy, it's time you headed home," she said gently. "Your parents will be worried." The boy looked between them, clearly picking up on the undercurrents. "Are you sure you'll be all right, Miss Reynolds?" "I'll be fine," she promised. "Deputy Prentice will see me home safely." After Billy departed, Zara crossed the room to where Jackson still stood, as if uncertain of his welcome. She reached for his hands, feeling them tremble slightly in hers. "What happened?" she asked softly. "The whole truth, please." Jackson took a deep breath, then told her everything about Garrett's brother seeking revenge, about the threats against her, about his fear that his past would always follow him, endangering those he cared about. As he spoke, Zara's expression shifted from concern to understanding and finally to a quiet determination. When he finished, she reached up to touch his face gently. "And now you're thinking you should leave," she said. It wasn't a question. Jackson couldn't meet her eyes. "It would be safer for you if I did. Safer, perhaps, but not better." Her voice was firm. "Look at me, Jackson." Reluctantly, he raised his gaze to hers. "I love you," she said simply. "I believe I've loved you since that day by the creek when you offered to walk me back to town. I've never said those words before because I wanted to be absolutely certain, but I am certain now." The declaration stunned him. They had grown close over the past months, had shown their affection in countless ways, but neither had spoken those 3 words aloud until now. "Zara, no, let me finish," she interrupted. "I love you and I understand what loving you might mean, that there could be dangers, complications, but that doesn't change how I feel or what I want." "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "A life with you. Here in Shoshone City or elsewhere if we must, but together." She gripped his hands tightly. "Don't you see? We're stronger together than apart. If you leave, you'll be alone again, vulnerable in your own way, and I'll be here worrying about you, loving you from a distance. How is that better?" Jackson struggled to find words. The depth of her commitment humbled him, awakened feelings he'd buried for so long he'd forgotten they existed. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me," he admitted finally. "Because of what I've done, who I've been." "And I couldn't bear to lose you to fear," she replied. "Not when we've come so far." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You once told me you don't pray, that you don't believe anyone is listening." "That's right," he acknowledged, unsure where she was going with this. "Then let me whisper for you," Zara said softly. "Let me believe enough for both of us until you find your own faith in God in the future in us." The offer, so simple, so profound, broke something open inside Jackson. All the barriers he'd built, the defenses he'd maintained for years, they crumbled in the face of her unwavering love. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "Love isn't about deserving," she murmured against his chest. "It's about choosing." "And I choose you, Jackson Prentice, past and all." He held her tightly, feeling as though he'd been wandering in the wilderness for years and had finally, unexpectedly, found his way home. When he spoke again, the words came from the depths of his soul. "I love you too," he said, "and I choose you. If you'll have me." Zara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Is that a proposal, Deputy Prentice? A A smile tugged at his lips despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "Not exactly how I planned it. I was going to do this properly with a ring and everything." Her expression brightened with surprise. "You have a ring?" "Not yet, but Mr. Tanner's making one." Jackson took her hands in his. "That's why I was at his place today. I was going to ask you next week when everything was ready." "And what were you going to ask me?" Zara prompted, her smile radiant. Jackson took a deep breath, then lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands in his. The gesture felt right, proper, a formal acknowledgement of the commitment he was making. "Zara Reynolds, I'm not a man of many words or grand gestures. But I love you with everything I am, everything I have. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, with all my heart." When he rose and took her in his arms again, the kiss they shared was a promise of love, of partnership, of facing whatever came their way together rather than apart. Outside the schoolhouse, the sun was setting over Shoshone City, painting the buildings in gold and rose. Inside, a schoolteacher and a cowboy who had never believed in prayer found their own kind of faith in each other's arms. The wedding took place in June, when the prairie was alive with wildflowers. Despite Zara's father's initial reservations about her marrying a former gun hand, he traveled from Boston to perform the ceremony, won over by the evident depth of feeling between his daughter and Jackson. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which was held in the meadow by the creek where Jackson and Zara had first truly connected. Billy Tanner, bursting with pride, served as Jackson's best man, while Mrs. Tanner stood as Zara's matron of honor. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of woven branches and flowers, Jackson felt a peace he had never known before. The ring on Zara's finger, a delicate silver band with a small but perfect sapphire that matched her husband's eyes, caught the sunlight as she recited her promises. When Reverend Reynolds invited everyone to pray over the newly wedded couple, Jackson surprised Zara by bowing his head alongside her. Though he still struggled with formal religion, he had begun, in his own way, to reach for something beyond himself, sometimes in whispered conversations with the stars, sometimes in quiet moments beside Zara as she prayed. "I'll always whisper for you," she had promised him the night before their wedding. "But I believe someday you'll find your own words." The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and more genuine goodwill than Jackson had ever experienced. When they finally departed for the small house they had purchased at the edge of town, the former Jenkins place, renovated with help from friends and neighbors, Jackson felt as though he was living in a dream. "Happy, Mrs. Prentice?" he asked as he carried his bride across the threshold of their home. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied, kissing him soundly once he set her on her feet. "And you?" "Same," he admitted, drawing her close. "Though I'm still not entirely convinced I'm not going to wake up back on the trail somewhere alone." "Well," Zara said, her eyes twinkling with mischief and promise, "I suppose I'll just have to convince you that this is real." And she did, thoroughly and joyfully throughout their wedding night and the days that followed. Life settled into a rhythm for the Prentices. Jackson continued as deputy, eventually becoming sheriff when Mills retired 2 years later. Zara taught at the schoolhouse, expanding the curriculum to include more advanced subjects as her students progressed. They faced challenges, of course a severe winter that tested the town's resources, a brief resurgence of Garrett's brother's vendetta, resolved permanently when the man made the mistake of drawing on Jackson in front of witnesses, giving the sheriff no choice but to defend himself, and the usual trials of building a life together. But through it all, they remained each other's strength and comfort. When Zara suffered a miscarriage in their second year of marriage, it was Jackson who held her through the long nights of grief, who whispered words of hope and love when she couldn't find her own. And when, a year later, she gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas, after Jackson's long-deceased father, it was Zara who guided her husband's trembling hands as he held his child for the first time, who showed him he could be the father he had never had himself. The years passed, bringing changes to Shoshone City and to the Prentice family. The railroad finally reached the town, bringing growth and prosperity. Billy Tanner, now a young man, took over his father's blacksmith shop, but expanded into more refined metalwork, creating pieces that were sought after throughout the territory. He never forgot the man and woman who had changed the course of his life with reading lessons and a hunting knife. Thomas Prentice was joined by a sister, Eleanor, named for Zara's mother. The children grew up in a home filled with books and stories, with a father who taught them to track and ride and a mother who instilled in them a love of learning and a compassion for others. And if the townspeople sometimes saw their sheriff standing alone under the stars at night, speaking words too quiet for others to hear, or if they noticed that their schoolteacher would sometimes slip her hand into her husband's during public prayers, whispering along with the words he couldn't yet say himself, they simply smiled and looked away, respecting the private faith that had grown between two people who had found each other against all odds. On their 10th anniversary, Jackson took Zara back to the creek where they had first connected. A picnic basket sat between them as they watched the water flow, silver bright in the June sunshine. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked suddenly. "Staying here with me instead of returning east?" "You could have had a different life." Zara looked at him with surprise. "Never, not for a single moment." She reached for his hand. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be. Even with all the trouble I brought with me, especially with that," she said firmly. "Because it led to all this, our home, our children, our life together." Jackson squeezed her hand, still amazed after all these years that she had chosen him, had helped him build a life he'd never imagined possible. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth. Zara unwrapped it curiously, revealing a silver locket on a delicate chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny painting of their children on one side and on the other an inscription, "For the woman who whispers for me, with love eternal, J." Tears welled in her eyes as Jackson fastened the locket around her neck. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, still finding it remarkable that this woman, strong, intelligent, compassionate, was his wife, the mother of his children, the center of his world. As they sat together by the creek, the same creek where a lonely cowboy and a determined schoolteacher had begun their unlikely journey together, Jackson felt a familiar sense of gratitude wash over him. This time, instead of keeping it inside, he gave it voice, not in formal prayer, but in simple words spoken from the heart. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking up at the blue Montana sky, "for all of it." Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand warm in his. "See," she murmured. "You found your words after all." And so he had words of love, of gratitude, of faith in something larger than himself. Not the faith of church pews and Sunday sermons, perhaps, but a faith nonetheless. Faith in love, faith in family. Faith in the power of a whispered prayer from the woman who had changed everything. As they walked home hand in hand, Jackson Prentice, once a solitary drifter, now a husband, father, and respected sheriff, knew with absolute certainty that he had found the greatest blessing a man could ask for. Not just a place to belong, but people to belong with. And though he might never be comfortable with formal prayer, he had learned that there were many ways to express gratitude for the life he had been given through service to his community, through love for his family, And sometimes, on quiet nights beneath the vast Montana sky, through whispered words of his own,